put the puzzle together, piece by piece, and discover the whole truth.
Let me introduce you to my good friend Francois Duplessis. Francois and I have known each other for 20 years, and Francois has a deep interest in archaeology and history, and he's traveled to the Middle East more than 30, 40 times, I believe, over the last 30 years. And he will be telling us about the science of archaeology and its bearing on modern-day occurrences. Francois.
Yes, we had good times and bad times, Walter, but we collected a lot of information. I was traveling in a little rented car, and I stopped near Hebron. Some Bedouin woman was selling these oil lamps. Of course, you've got to bargain with these people. And I got it and I brought it back to South Africa, and one of the universities looked at the catalogue, and they dated this oil lamp about 1000 BC to the time of King David. Now I asked this little lamp if he brought some light to the dark palace of the king, especially with his problems with Bathsheba. But the lamp remained silent. He didn't gossip about King David. At the end of this little presentation, I want to talk more about this little lamp. Now, Walter and myself went to very interesting places overseas. Here you're looking at a holder which people used to dye clothes in. And we'll be coming back to this site. Here you see him looking at this huge vase with a tremendous history. When we come back, we look at the sources and we get some interesting stories. Here you see my friend looking at some Hittite inscriptions. By the way, only in 1947, Bossart, a German archaeologist, decoded this mystic language of the Hittites. And now we can read about it. Here you see my friend Walter at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, where they are excavating at Jarablus, the biblical site of Carchemish. Andre, the man who's filming us, here you see him standing at the site at Jarablus. Why did we go here? Because biblical history expired right here. And then Walter and myself went to Tyre, and here you're looking at some of the ruins of the island that used to be a kilometer offshore. This is tremendous. You know, the prophet Ezekiel in 587 predicted that this entire city would be dumped into the sea. And here Walter is pointing to some of the remains of the ancient city of Tyre. I want to tell you more about this. This is exciting. This is tremendous. And then at Babylon, here you look at a picture of Saddam Hussein. Right in front of him is a picture of Nabuchodonosor. That's the biblical Nebuchadnezzar. And on the far right, you see Cyrus the Great and the symbolism of Saddam on this picture. And Walter is going to talk more about this interesting man, Saddam Hussein and Nebuchadnezzar. Here you look at the great banquet hall in Babylon, which Saddam Hussein restored, where the finger wrote many, many tekel ufarsin. This is the throne room of the king, and Walter is going to tell you about the dream of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes, that'll be exciting. Don't miss that.
And he's going to give us the interpretation. And here you see Walter at the Pergamon Museum with his wife Sonika in Berlin. He's going to give you exciting stories about the fall of this city. The Bible is a true book. Archaeology doesn't prove it to be true. It just affirms the fact that it's an inspired book. Cyrus the Great, I'm going to do a little bit on typology. Cyrus the Great delivered the ancient people of God, and Christ will also come and deliver us soon. At Tarnas, we're going to study the story, the life story of Joseph, who's also a type of Christ. It is amazing. And here, Walter and myself are standing in Egypt. We want to share wonderful things to you. Not only camel rides, but the story of archaeology. This is Hazor in the north of Israel. Marvelous discoveries have been made here. I stood here while the archaeologists assembled all the different pieces of a broken vase. And then they put it together, and there you see it. This one, by the way, Walter and myself saw at Amman in the Archaeological Museum. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls were placed in this vase. It's tremendous. Look at the cracks. But to us, it's marvelous. Archaeologists put it together. It's in the museum, and everybody marvels at the discovery and restoration of this. Now, coming back to my little lambs, a friend of mine lit them up, and just look at the beautiful picture, a burning light. You know, this is the story of archaeology, looking for the seeming worthless stuff. This is the work of Christ. All of us are covered with sands of reproach, sin, guilt feelings, depression. He comes with his spade of salvation. He digs till he finds the broken pieces, and then he puts them all together. Maybe your flame of hope is gone. Like this little lamp, Christ wants to put a flame of hope in your life. We're going to put the different pieces of the ancient world together, and Walter's going to put the different pieces of prophecy together, and eventually you'll have the whole truth. God bless you as you continue looking at our presentations.
Put the puzzle together, piece by piece, and discover the whole truth.
Today we're going to talk about bones in stones. Now, bones in stones are the evolutionary exhibit A in terms of evidence for evolution. But there's more than one way to interpret these things. Now, I'm going to go through the geological column and through the fossil record, and we're going to look at whether there's an alternative explanation for what we see in nature. When we look at the geological column, which we discussed previously, we see that the oldest layers are at the bottom, but associated with those old layers, we have fossils. And these fossils are ordered in a particular sequence, which is taken to represent the evolutionary process over time. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves today is, does this fossil record necessarily, absolutely support the evolutionary paradigm, or does it not? It appears that the primitive organisms, so they say, are associated with the lower layers, and the more advanced organisms, like the mammals and the birds, associated with the top layers, and this is used as evidence for change over time. The timeline of the history of life begins very early, and we're looking today at the macrofossils. That's the big animals on the planet, those that are multicellular and complex, and they start around about 600 million years ago, and then they advance through the various stages of the fish phase, the amphibian phase, the reptile phase, the mammals, until we finally get to the evolution of man. Now, the question is this evolutionary record a record of time, or does it perhaps represent something else? Now, if we look at the fossil record and we go to the bottom layers, we have the Cambrian right at the bottom, and this Cambrian is supposed to be the time period when the first macro fossils or the first macro life forms evolved on this planet. And then we are told, as we go up through the process, through time, as we come up higher, for example, up here to the Ordovicium, this blue one over here, then we have, past the Ordovicium to the Devonian at least, then we have the evolution of the fishes and all the swimming creatures that are associated with this time period. If we go a little bit higher, we come to the period of the dinosaurs, And eventually, as these creatures become extinct, in the very uppermost layers, we have the evolution of the mammals. Now, scientists in the books depict these creatures as very strange and weird and very different to what we have today. And this is an artist's impression in a typical textbook fashion of what these creatures looked like. Of course, when you look at the fossil record, it is logical to assume that at the bottom of the fossil record, we will have the most primitive organisms, or the oldest. And as we proceed up the geological column, we will get the more advanced creatures. When we look at these fossils in the fossil record, we find the principle of fossil correlation is used by the scientific world. For example, if you find a fossil such as this creature down here, this mollusk, and you go to another fossil assemblage and you find a similar creature in those fossil beds, then the assumption is made that they are of the same age. But this is not necessarily so, although that is the assumption that is made. It doesn't answer the question how old the fossils are. So we can say the fossil is as old as the material it is buried in, or the bed that it is buried in, which is dated by geological methods. Now, how do fossils form? If we go to the textbooks, this is a classic textbook. It's old and represents that which is the norm even to this day. If covered by moist sediment, weathering is prevented, and for these reasons, quick burial is perhaps the most important condition favoring fossilization. In other words, to become a fossil, oxygen has to be removed and the animal has to fossilize quickly. Waterborne sediments are so much more widely distributed than all other agents of burial that they include the great majority of fossils. So it seems as if a watery demise seems to be the ultimate way in which most fossils actually formed over time. If we look at this fossil assemblage over here, we see these fish beautifully preserved, and they have their scales intact. And obviously, these creatures were cut off from oxygen very rapidly, so something under the waters must have buried them rapidly. This is not a case where these creatures could have laid in a pond which dried up and then they fossilized over a long period of time because scavengers would have eaten them, the scales would have deteriorated, etc. If we see this creature over here, this is associated with the early evolution of fishes because they have these huge bony scales which are considered primitive. But of course, there are creatures today which also have bony scales such as we just saw. For the sturgeon, for example, has such scales, and it is considered a primitive fish, but it is living today. We also find fossil beds with tremendous concentrations of scales embedded in the rocks. Now, we don't find that happening today. If you go and look in the ocean today, where animals die, and you should have the scales forming or being covered in the bottom, we don't see that because they dissolve over time, and through abrasion they disappear before they become fossilized. So these are special conditions which show that it must have happened rapidly. We also find fossils, large and small ones, some in a state of deterioration, some in a lesser state of deterioration, showing that some were buried before others. Some had floated some while before they were buried and showed deterioration. Others were buried instantly. And then we have interesting fossils such as these, where we have a fish within a fish. In other words, this creature was still having a meal when suddenly it was fossilized. So these are catastrophic events and not necessarily events over long periods of time. This fish over here is a magnificent specimen. You can see that it is perfectly preserved. The scales are intact. This creature must have been buried instantly. Now, what buries a creature like this instantly if it is not some catastrophic event, such as, for example, an underwater mud flow, a turbidite, which covered it and cut it off from oxygen so that it could be preserved in this fashion. Now, science has said that the fossil record is incomplete and we don't have all the pieces because some of the softer-bodied creatures don't fossilize readily. But we find plenty of soft-bodied creatures in the fossil record, like, for example, this one over here. Here we have a jellyfish, perfectly preserved, and there are numerous soft-bodied creatures of the various worm varieties which are perfectly preserved. So that also is not necessarily always the case. Here is a quote by Olson, an evolutionist, who writes, "Time and again, wind, water, and ice have cut and destroyed rocks that have been elevated to form continents. That there is a fossil record at all seems rather remarkable." Now, imagine a planet subject to the same conditions as today. Surely, erosion should have taken away the various layers over time. As we have said before, it would take a mere 10.2 million years at the lowest erosion level that we experience in some of our desert regions today to eradicate the continents down to sea level. So why is there still a fossil record? It should have been, as the scientist points out, been eradicated many, many times over, but it is still there, from the youngest layers to the oldest layers. And all of these time periods exceed the erosion periods that we mentioned. So this is rather remarkable. And then we have another misnomer. If evolution is right, now I used to be an evolutionist, as I have told you before, and I used to be a Darwinist. But over time, I had to change my opinion, and I became what they call a punctuated equilibriumist, or a neo-Darwinist. You see, the fossil record does not show a slow transition over time from one form to another. But what we see fully formed creatures and then fully formed different creatures. So the conjecture was that the evolution in between was so rapid that it wasn't picked up in the fossil record. But even that doesn't go far enough. For example, here Time magazine had an issue in which they referred to evolution's Big Bang, evolving at supersonic speed. And these were the professors that largely came from the neo-Darwinistic schools at Harvard and other top universities in the world. And they discussed this interesting issue of when life exploded. Now here is the journal Scientific American, and it sums up this concept for us very succinctly. It's an article written here entitled "The Big Bang of Animal Evolution." And the author is Jeffrey Leventon. He's professor and chair of the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the State University of New York in Stony Bridge. He published this in 1992, summing up the current knowledge on this particular issue. And he speaks about the Cambrian explosion. Now, let's just go back a step. The Cambrian is the earliest fossil layer where you have the macrofossils development. So that's the baseline. That's where you should have the most primitive organisms, and then given the process and the time periods involved in evolutionary change, it must have taken a very, very long time period for the various different categories of animals to have evolved. But listen to what he says. The Cambrian explosion was characterized by the sudden and roughly simultaneous appearance of many diverse animal forms almost 600 million years ago. No other period in the history of animal life can match this remarkable, and note these words, burst of evolutionary creativity. So instead of having what we would expect, a slow change over time, suddenly, boom, there these creatures appear. Other evidence that is cited from ribosomal studies of RNA, for example, is that many phyla appeared almost simultaneously. Now, this is mind-boggling. A phylum is a huge category of animals, like all the mollusks, for example, all the various snails and slugs and sea mollusks, all of these creatures in one big category. Or if you look at the arthropods, all the jointed-legged creatures, which includes anything from a crab to marine organisms of that nature, all the way up to insects, for example. That's a phylum. Or the phylum Chordata, the one that we belong to, where all the vertebrates belong to, for example. These are huge categories. Now, is it probable that these creatures appeared simultaneously at the same time? So as a Darwinist, I moved from Darwinism, slow gradual change, to punctuated equilibrium, rapid change over time with episodes of evolution and then separated in time. But here we see that everything appears almost simultaneously. Now, doesn't that bring us closer to creation? So is the fossil record really what science would want us to believe? In fact, the scientist says fast turns out to be much faster than anyone ever thought. Well, how fast? The Bible says, he spoke and it stood fast. Now that's pretty fast. Now here in the section on paleontology in the journal Nature, Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the advocates of neo-Darwinism, has some very interesting things to say. He talks about the older textbooks which proclaim that our phylum, now that's the one that should have appeared very, very late in the evolutionary time period. The Chordata did not appear until the Ordovician period, and here they find this fossil or these types already in the Cambrian. Now that is very disconcerting. And he talks about this find and Chen and his colleagues' discovery of this beautifully, unambiguously preserved chordate. And he says, well, that puts an end, basically, to the misguided effort in asserting specialness for our ancestry. Chordates arose in the Cambrian explosion. So everything was there from the beginning. So what's the difference between that and evolution? Very little. Well, here's another statement where he goes on to say that it has been proven that full diversity was reached within the Cambrian explosion itself. In other words, all the myriads of diverse animal types and groups appeared instantly. Now, if we read the Bible, it says, God created, he spoke, and it stood fast. And science is basically saying exactly the same thing, although denying the tenets of what is actually said there. Now, is this something new? No. Gould continues to write, and he says Charles Darwin already faced this challenge to his gradualistic preference that things evolved slowly, writing in his first edition of Origin of Species that the case at present must remain inexplicable and that it may be truly argued as a valid argument against his views. That's fascinating. So even from the beginning, scientists were actually aware of this issue. Now, having been an evolutionist myself, all of these issues were known to me. But the problem was, I was not willing to accept the biblical paradigm because I was an atheist, and that was outside of my scope, outside of my paradigm of thinking. Now, if we look at the textbooks of how life evolved and how the creatures gave rise one to the other, we will find these evolutionary trees in the fossils, in the fossil assemblages. So they say. And so if we look at the fish, for example, you will have them down here on the scale, and then as you go up through time, you will have the creatures that evolved over time that are living today, like the lampreys, for example, these creatures up here, which are more undulating like a snake than anything else. Then you have the chondrichthyes, which is the sharks, those we have, and you have the other fishes and the bony fishes and the amphibians. But note this interesting point, that there is nothing in between the level where they arose from and where we are today. In other words, where are the in-between fossils? There are conjectures as to what they may have been or what they could have evolved from, but they themselves are not there. These linkages that we have at the bottom here, where the one form arose out of the other, doesn't exist either. So what we actually have is not an evolutionary tree, but an evolutionary lawn. In other words, all the lines next to each other, going back to a particular point. So an amphibian, a frog, has always been a frog, has always been a frog, has always been a frog. And a fish has always been a fish, has always been a fish. If we go to the turtles and the lizards and the snakes and all of these interesting reptiles and some of the mammals, they have always been what they were before. The only difference is that they were often larger than they are today, and that there was more variety in what we saw in the past than what we see today. But these creatures have always been the same in the fossil record. There is no record of gradual change from one form to the other. Now, if we think about this logically, then evolutionary processes should require the following. Number one, you should see advancement from simple to complex. I mean, that's logical, right? You don't start with the complex and go to the simple. Secondly, you must have development from small to large. You cannot evolve from the elephant to the amoeba. You have to start with the amoeba and progress to the elephant. So you should see small to large. And many scientists have recognized this and published widely on it. Then you must have low diversity going towards high diversity. Obviously, if life is a chance event and starts here somewhere in the distant past, then there must have been few animals then, as opposed to what we have later. So that's what you would expect if evolution were true. However, what you find is exactly the opposite. What we have is, firstly, instances of irreducible complexity. There are some structures and organs in the body which need to be as complex as they are in order to function in any way. So you cannot produce that structure by slow increments and improvements over time. It either works or it doesn't. So that is the first problem. There is no simplicity here. It has to start complex. Secondly, there seems to be a reversed size sequence in the fossil record. Everything in the past was bigger than it is today. And you would expect the reverse. And thirdly, you have reversed diversity. If we look at the fossil record today, we have only a fraction of what there was before. In other words, the planet is getting less and less and less populated in terms of diversity. So we have the exact opposite of what you would expect. Now, Gould also wrote this interesting statement, published in Natural History. He says, the family trees that adorn our textbooks are based on inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. In other words, what we see in the textbooks, these trees of evolutionary advance from one form of life to the other, like, for example, the evolution of the horse, where you start with the smallest down at the bottom, Eohippus and Eohippus, and you go up to Merychippus and all of these horse forms to the modern Equus right on the top, then this family tree is depicted as a fact. In fact, most of these family trees, all of them, are based on inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. So what I'm saying is that a scientist sits with the various fossils, puts them together as he seems fit, or how it seems logical to him how they could have evolved. Now that is perfectly reasonable. It doesn't necessarily make it right, however. For example, they would have the smallest horse at the bottom, once called Hyracotherium, and now called Eohippus, and then they would go up and have the larger ones at the top, and they would look at things like foot structure, etc. And a typical timeline would have them going back 60 million years, starting from small to large. Of course, this is not the case. You don't actually find that. What you have is small and large living at the same time. These fossils come out of the same beds, and it is the conjectures of the scientists that put them together as they would seem fit. These horses over here, for example, occur in Iceland, and these horses are very different to the normal horses that we find on the mainland. And yet we know that the Vikings brought them there only a few hundred years ago. So they've been around for about 800 years. So these changes are not changes that took place over millions of years. When it comes to the dinosaurs, we have a totally different story. And where did they come from? Did they give rise to birds? Did they not give rise to birds? Do we have living dinosaurs today? This is what the textbook depicts, a weird and wonderful world of strange creatures roaming the planet. Now, I think we should take a short break, and when we come back, we will look at this dinosaur issue and how they possibly, if they did, could have given rise to birds or not.
Put the puzzle together, piece by piece, and discover the whole truth. Put the puzzle together, piece by piece, and discover the whole truth.
Well, if we look at these dinosaurs, as we were discussing, we find that the tree, the evolutionary tree that they have of dinosaurs, again, comes out of the mind. It doesn't depict one creature evolving into the other of that nature at all. If we go here to the Morrison Formation in Dinosaur National Monument, has some of these marvelous fossils depicted. We find these huge fossils, and what's interesting about them is that they are washed into position, so they are stream orientated. We find the same with the fossils in the Karoo. The creatures are stream orientated. Now that's catastrophism, not slow evolution over millions of years. Well, some might argue that they were washed in position or into position in rivers that came down periodically. But if you take the Karoo Basin or the Morrison, that's not a river. It stretches over hundreds of thousands of square miles. So that cannot be. And then you find also these strange fossil assemblages where you have certain types represented more than others. In other words, not a natural ecological setup like Allosaurus. Let's have a look at this creature, Tyrannosaurus rex, which grabs the imagination of the youth so much. And so many movies have been made depicting this creature. Here it is depicted as the ultimate vicious carnivore in the world, and that is the picture of dinosaurs that we have in the world generally. Well, here's an interesting quote from Mary Schweitzer from Montana University, published in the journal Science, and she was looking at T-Rex bones, and she quotes, she writes, "It was like looking at a slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones after all are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long?" So we find all these interesting fossil evidences that show that these creatures might not be as old as we might conjecture. Yes, they were very huge, but then all the creatures were larger then than they are today. We find in the museums that all of these dinosaur forms are shown as very bloodthirsty, and you have the blood and the gore and the ripping and the tearing each other up while they are running. And you have these animated models of these bloodthirsty dinosaurs with the blood around their mouths. Now, if you look at this dinosaur over here, those teeth are not typical teeth of a carnivore, flesh-tearing teeth. They are more like these little lizards today. I would be quite comfortable in putting my arm into that mouth, and I don't think much would happen to me. It's probably just a kind, good lizard. It doesn't have to be depicted like that. They range from small to very, very large, like these brontosauruses. And then we have also these interesting ones, like Triceratops, and because it has 3 horns, they will say it had to protect itself from all the vicious dinosaurs around it. But that may not necessarily be the case. For example, if we look at this modern-day creature, it has 3 horns of those there to protect it against all the vicious predators around it. Surely not. Those are secondary sex characteristics, and there is no reason to believe that it was different in the past. those 3 magnificent horns were probably there to attract the ladies and to ward off any other suitors that might have been interested. There are over 100 published theories about the extinction of the dinosaurs, ranging from the fascinating to the absurd. But it's interesting that a universal flood does not feature amongst those theories, even though they all have a watery demise and seem to be buried in watery graves. Isn't that interesting? Now, the theory goes that dinosaurs gave rise to birds. And here we have all these depictions in the museums of the world: Oviraptor, Velociraptor, all of the possible forms that might have had feathers and had laid eggs and took care of them like birds do. There's the famous case of Archaeopteryx, which today is considered a fully formed, flying, normal bird. So there is not much of conjecture regarding this creature anymore. Now, a very famous fossil that serves as an intermediary in today's thinking is Sinosauropteryx. Here it is. It's supposed to have had feathers. And the idea of this feathered dinosaur giving rise to modern birds is very well established in the general literature, especially the popular literature, and also, of course, in the entertainment world. Now let's have a look at some top published information in top journals like Science, for example. Here it states, the new research shows that birds lack the embryonic thumb that dinosaurs had, suggesting that it is almost impossible for the species to be closely related. So there are scientists like Alan Fiducia who believe that they cannot possibly be related. A team led by bird experts, Alan Fiducia, chairman of biology of the University of North Carolina, studied bird embryos under a microscope, published their studies in the journal Science, and it seems as there is no relationship there. Another team led by John Rubin, a respiratory physiologist at Oregon State University, he looks at this creature, he looks at the bellow-like lungs that you find in this intermediary fossil, and he conjectures that it is impossible for this lung to have given rise to the very complex lung which you have in birds. For example, the lungs of mammals and birds are bellow-like. The air goes in and goes out through the same orifice. But when you come to birds, they have a through-flow lung, which makes it much more capable of absorbing oxygen. That's why we need oxygen tanks on top of Mount Everest to survive, and the ducks go flying overhead without a problem. See, they have a totally different lung system, and the complexity of the feather also defies the imagination. These structures appeared suddenly. Alan Fiducia writes, it's biophysically impossible to evolve flight from such large bipeds with foreshortened forelimbs and heavy balancing tails, exactly the wrong anatomy for flight. And the theropod dinosaur origin of birds, in my opinion, will be the greatest embarrassment of paleontology of the 20th century. You see, the top scientists don't concur with what the media puts out. Now, there's an interesting debate going on between people such as Stores Olson, who is the curator of birds at the National Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, and the popular press, if you like, for example, National Geographic. He writes here, for example, the feathered dinosaur pictures are simply imaginary, have no place outside of science fiction. These are the top movers and shakers, and they concur that this link is impossible. But you don't find it in the media. You don't find it in the level of the school or in the comic book. The idea of a feathered dinosaur and theropod origin of birds is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors at Nature, the top journal of science in Britain, and National Geographic, who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselyters of the faith. He calls it a faith. Truth and careful scientific weighing of the evidence have been among the first casualties in their program, which is now fast becoming one of the grander scientific hoaxes of our age, the paleontological equivalent of cold fusion. So that which is shown to be fact is not necessarily so. You know, there are interesting things out there in the world which make us think. The Ica stones of Peru are very interesting. We find these interesting pictures upon them. And for example, there on this one on the left over here, you have a triceratops. There's no doubt about that. On the one on the right over here, you have an Allosaurus or a Tyrannosaurus depicted together with a man. And so down here you have a flying dinosaur type creature. The pterodactyls also depicted together with a man. And there are other paintings as well of Bushman origin, etc., which seem to indicate the same kind of thing. Now, this type of thing occurs relatively frequently, like, for example, the mastodons. We find cave drawings of those, although it was surmised that man hadn't evolved when these creatures were on the planet. Now, if you look at this cute little creature, I just put it in there for fun, basilisk, it looks just like a little dragon. Now imagine some of these lizards quite large, different to what we have today in terms of size. Wouldn't this give rise to strange legends and strange conjectures? George Gaylord Simpson was one of the doyens of the evolutionary thinking, and in his famous book, The Meaning of Evolution, he writes, "It has been suggested that all animals are now specialized and that the generalized forms on which major evolutionary development depends are absent. In fact, all animals have always been more or less specialized, and a really generalized living form is merely a myth or an abstraction." So that gets rid of another doyen theory in the evolutionary world. It is proposed that the animals started simple and then became more and more complex. We don't find this in the fossil record. We find that animals have always been complex. So yes, the ammonites might be extinct, but they were highly complex, squid-like creatures living in shells with very interesting jet propulsion. Nothing primitive about these creatures. Yes, they don't exist today, but then life forms are going extinct all the time. Trilobites, very interesting creatures, highly complex, the same complex arthropod-type eye that we find in creatures living today. And extinct, yes, but simple, definitely not. Living fossils show that there hasn't been much change. And you know, we talk about lizards, certain lizards like Sphenodon, or we talk about this nautilus, that there hasn't been much change, but we find this generally. Frogs have always been frogs. Tortoises have always been tortoises. Snakes have been snakes as we go down the fossil assemblages. If we look at creatures like the sea stars, for example, unchanged over time, except for size. Brittle stars, unchanged over time. From the delicate fossils that we find over here, here are fossil sea stars and brittle stars, unchanged from what we have in the fossil record. If we look at these, we have the fossil in the bottom and the living form in the top. Whether we're looking at the mollusks on the left or whether we're looking at the tortoises and the sea turtles on the right, unchanged. There is no evidence for this slow evolutionary change over time. Here is the lingula, the horseshoe crab, a very, very ancient creature, supposedly, living right there from the earliest times, unchanged till today. The coelacanth, very famous example, supposedly a representative of those first creatures that crawled out onto the land, unchanged from what its progenitors or its ancestors were like. If we look at the sharks, unchanged except for size. Look at this huge jaw over here from this freshwater shark. So what you have is giant creatures in the past, small creatures today. That is devolution, not evolution. We're going backwards, not forwards. The famous Sphenodon, Tuatara, this lizard that lives in New Zealand, unchanged over time. The tortoises, unchanged. If they're very large, like this one here from the Galapagos Islands, we assume, wow, this is something really special. Now imagine a fossil one that got much older because conditions in the past were perhaps better. It might be huge. Well, then we'd make it something totally different. But what if we compare a juvenile to an adult? So size doesn't necessarily make the creature a different species. Here you have the Galapagos marine iguana. Well, it's a vegetarian. It swims in the warm oceans and it eats plants like seaweed, etc. And then you have also the land iguana. Did you know that they can interbreed and produce viable offspring? And the Gila monster, the crocodile, the armadillo, the opossum, unchanged over time. Huge creatures, whether anteaters or whatever form of creature in the past, would be something else, a totally different species, but in fact, just a large form of what exists today. Here is a 1.5 meter fossil skull of an ancient crocodile type. Of course, another species because it occurs in the fossil record, but anatomically identical to what lives today. Here you have in its mouth a fully grown present-day crocodile, giving you an idea of the size of these creatures. Now, if crocodiles had time, reptiles continue to grow, unlike mammals, which cease to grow at a particular point. If it had time to continue to grow, it would become extremely large. Would that make it a different species? Definitely not. We have mega crocodiles in Africa if they are very old. And if they're young, well, then they are smaller. If we look at the insect world, there's another evolutionary misnomer. Here we have an insect in the fossil record with straight wings. Now, that's supposed to be primitive. Obviously, if you're going to fold your wings, put it under a carapace, that must be advanced. So this would be primitive, and this would be primitive. So the creatures that fly with fixed wings that they cannot fold or retract, they are considered primitive. Well, is that really so? Here we have a wasp. And there we have the wings of butterflies and creatures like that. And they can fold their wings. So the dragonflies are considered primitive, and those with folded wings are considered advanced. But they occur in the fossil record at exactly the same time. There's no evidence that the one gave rise to the other. So there's another misnomer. And then what would make a creature like a dragonfly primitive? Top scientists in the world, aeronautical scientists, study these creatures to design the helicopter and other aeronautical equipment based on these complex creatures. There's nothing simple about it. A praying mantis in amber on the right. On the left we have a praying mantis living today, unchanged in the fossil record. The eye of the insect, one of the most complex structures known to man. In fact, the very complex mirror system that we have in those eyes is what was used to design the Hubble telescope's mirror. And you know what? They couldn't get it right the first time. They had to go back and fix it again. Unchanged. There it appears in the fossil record in amber, unchanged. No sign of any evolution whatsoever. Insects in amber, whether crickets in the past or crickets today, unchanged. Ants in amber, unchanged. I cannot believe it, Fred. 60 million years since I've seen you, and you haven't changed a bit. So if we look at this evolutionary paradigm, and we see that, wow, everything was there from the beginning, all the phyla, it seems as if someone spoke and there they were. Yes, we have greater variety, we have greater diversity in the past, but that is not in line with evolutionary thinking. That's the opposite. So perhaps we are seeing a decline, not only in size and in diversity, but also in physiology. We are deteriorating. We're not as great as we think we are. This is the Welwitschia. This is an ancient plant. And if you go to Namibia, into the deserts, you will find this plant growing there. This is a first generation plant. This is a plant that is the oldest thing alive on this planet. And when you study it, you find that there are 4,000 to 5,000 years. This one is very interesting because it's growing in the ridges of a petrified tree. A tree that has been washed into position in a particular direction. In other words, again, catastrophic deposition by water. So the oldest thing alive today is about as old as the Bible says it should be if we consider the flood. Here we have the bristlecone pines. These are supposed to be the oldest trees on the planet. Some of these are dated considerably older than the 4,000 to 5,000 years since the flood. But then again, with bristlecone pines, you cannot tell the date exactly. It's very difficult because the rings are not very distinct. So what they use is they use carbon dating to verify the age, and they use the age to verify the carbon dating. That's circular reasoning. So let's stick to things where you can really depict the time and see where they evolved and how old they are. Let's go to the Redwood National State Park, where you have the giant redwoods. My wife was here and she was terribly cold when she was there. And here stands one of these beautiful trees, this giant redwood. The bark of this tree is protective against fire. And so that when the periodic fires sweep through the forest, these trees are protected. So what we have is first generation forests. And again, this first generation forest, this very ancient tree, exactly as old as it is supposed to be. Here I'm standing next to one of these giant trees, or standing even in one of these giant trees. They've made a road through it. The question that I have for you today is, does the fossil record absolutely, without a doubt, show transition over time from simple to complex? The answer is no. We have seen that the scientists say everything evolved simultaneously. In the Cambrian explosion, all the different phyla were represented from the beginning. Full diversity, says the literature, was established in the Cambrian. Even our group was there from the beginning. Then were those creatures simple? No. We saw from the scientific literature that they were highly complex, that they were always complex, and that this complexity is exactly of the same nature as the complexity which we see today. So there was no simple evolution. If we go further and we look at the diversity, more diversity in the past than at present. So is that evolution or is it devolution? Size, larger in the past than in the present. Evolution or devolution? It's the way you look at it. If we consider that a worldwide flood came and destroyed the creatures that lived prior to the flood, when they would have had perfect conditions, where they would have been relatively disease-free in those early stages, relatively unaffected by DNA changes accumulated over time, and then you would find exactly what you would expect. Very large creatures that had grown to that size because the conditions were in line with what you would expect under those circumstances. Then came the destruction. The creatures are in watery graves, but they are the same in form and in shape as they are today. So it is our choice whether we want to believe what science says, which is logical, but not necessarily right, or whether we want to believe the biblical paradigm. God created, God destroyed the world with the flood, and what we see today is a remnant of what was there before. The choice is ours.
Put the puzzle together, piece by piece, and discover the whole truth. Would you like to know the whole truth about dinosaurs and the Ice Age?
Join us next time for an interesting trip into time, where it is said that mammals reigned. Is Lucy more closely related to humans than other Australopithecines? Note the answer. This question is still unanswered, partly because each kind of Australopithecine has unique features that could link it with human beings. Now, isn't this amazing? Australopithecines are apes. They say we have so many remarkable resemblances to apes. And one of the most favorite ones, of course, is the similarity of the DNA. We share so many common genes. Well over 95% of the genes are in common. But these are only structural genes, not the controlling genes. And a tiny little percentage would make a huge difference. What if we shared 75% of the genes with a particular species? Would that make us related? Well, if it did so, we'd be related to the banana, because we share 76% of those genes. So I'm not too enthralled by the similarity of the gene pools.